She is passionate. She is enthusiastic. She is dogged and determined. She's a fighter and an advocate and a leader. And she is inspired and enlightened under the sun that she was born under. She's one of those lucky people who was born under the sun and shines all the time. The other thing to know about Jennifer is she's one of these rare people who actually thinks out of both sides of her brain. So she graduates at the top of her class from Berkeley. She's Phi Beta Kappa. She gives it up to go be an actress and go on the dating game. She goes to Harvard Law School. She's the president of the Law Review. And she marries a soulful Italian-Irish guitar player. She goes to Michigan. She becomes the tough-on-crime attorney general, the U.S. attorney, the governor, and she's the first person who wants to play charades. I don't know, and then you look at her and you go, and she has to be so beautiful, really? Come on, please. Leave a little room for the rest of us. It is with great love and gratitude that I get to introduce the former governor of Michigan and my friend Jennifer Granholm and Karen Breslaw.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Welcome to She Shares. Thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. And we want to thank our She Shares sponsors, Karen Skelton with Skelton Strategies, Donna Lucas, and Tina Thomas. Our media sponsors, we're thrilled to have KCRA3 and Comstocks Magazine. And our contributing sponsor is Runyon, Zaltzman, and Einhorn. We also want to thank Donna Lucas and the Sutter Club for this beautiful space today. Those of you who've been to She Shares before know that a huge part of the reason we gather is to share the collective learning and the experience in this room, not only with each other, but with the next generation of women leaders. And so for each She Shares, we have young women join us, and they are mentored for the day by a She Shares guest. And I want to introduce our mentees and mentors today. I'm going to introduce everybody, and if you just hold your applause, we'll recognize everybody at once. But if you could stand when I call your name. Heather David is a senior at McClatchy High School. She's mentored by Judge Kimberly Mueller. Brene Taylor, a senior at Burbank High School, is mentored by Edie Lambert from KCRA. And Alicia Ramirez at William Jessup University is mentored by Deirdre Fitzpatrick, also with KCRA. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. And now I want to turn to our guest. You've heard some wonderful things about Jennifer Granholm. You know she was the governor of Michigan for 2 terms, and that she's a distinguished practitioner of law at UC Berkeley. She holds degrees from UC Berkeley and from Harvard Law School. She is the author, together with her husband Dan Mulhern, of A Governor's Story, The Fight for Jobs in America's Future. But you may not know this, that she was named Commander of the Royal Order of the Polar Star, first class, by the King of Sweden for her work in clean energy. And as governor of Michigan, she was afforded the title Her Excellency. Welcome the most excellent Jennifer Granholm.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. Please call me Jennifer, though.
Okay, you got it. I want to know, given where you've been in your career, was there anything in your life or in your family growing up that would have hinted at where you were going to end up?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. Actually, you know, it's an interesting question because I often wonder that myself. I keep thinking about how did this notion of being able to lead or wanting to even really enter in, and I think about, you know, my mom who's still alive, and my mom and dad are one of the reasons why my husband and I are back here, because I married Michigan, but I was raised in California and went to San Carlos High School, which doesn't even exist anymore, in Berkeley as an undergrad. But my mom, they are from Canada, and my dad's first generation immigrant, and I was the first person in my family to go to college. And my parents were always like, oh, you've got to go to college, because there's not even a question, because they didn't, especially my mom, never had the opportunity. So she would tuck me in at night, and she would tell me all sorts of pearls of wisdom from her generation. She would say things like, don't talk about yourself, because people don't want to hear it. You ask people about themselves, right? She would say things like, never ask strangers for money.
You took that to heart.
Right? She would say, make sure you do not wear your good clothes every day, only on Sundays. And she would say, if you're in a competition with a boy, let the boy win. Now, how I ever got elected with any of that advice, I will never know, but with especially the boy part. But she also would say, you put on your wings and fly. You can be anything you want to be. So I really am grateful to her. And to my dad, too, who's a silent Swede. He had high expectations, but he didn't communicate much about them. But Mom sort of lived a bit vicariously through me, because she felt trapped in her generation. And so she, gave me some notions. And I suppose that's where I got it.
So she was maybe your first mentor.
I would say that, yeah. I mean, she would never say that. She would never say, mentor me, I can't even cook. But she, I'm sure, indirectly is someone I would attribute that to.
Now, you left high school headed not for college directly, but for Hollywood.
What a nut.
And we'd love to hear a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, what a ridiculous thing. I actually tell young people all the time, try, especially out of high school, and if you want to take a gap year, that would be a great time to do it, or after college, because you're only young once, right? So I was all about Katharine Hepburn when I was growing up. And I wanted to be the next Katharine Hepburn or the next female Sir Laurence Olivier. And so I went to LA thinking that, I would be, discovered, which was totally ridiculous. And I got an agent, and he said, well, since you can't sing and you can't dance and you probably can't act, go on the dating game. And maybe you'll be discovered that way. Well, anyway, suffice it to say,
one word, YouTube.
Yeah, it's terrible and it's horrifying. So please don't look it up. In fact, in my runs for office, I knew that I was on the dating game when I was 18 and 19 years old. And I was so glad that it was before YouTube and before people recorded stuff, because it was like in 1978. And I thought, they'll never find the tape. I didn't have the tape. But somebody found the tape. Not when I was running for office, hallelujah, but only recently.
Yes.
Like in the past year, somebody found this tape of me on the dating game. And let's just say that I could have housed an entire flock of birds in my hair. I had mom pants up to here, although it wasn't mom pants at the time. It was just horrifying, really, really. So I have better work in my repertoire than the dating game. But I came back from that after a couple of years trying that. It didn't work out. I was really, actually, LA, it did not gel for me. Mm-hmm. I felt like I was, this was in the era of like Farrah Fawcett and, lots of, as we used to say, T&A. And it just wasn't for me. And I said, darn it, I'm going to show them. I'm going to go to Berkeley and I'm going to get the best grades and I'm going to, be somebody, because I'm not being anybody down here. Actually, Karen, you know this. I worked for the LA Times in the circulation department, taking complaints about people whose papers didn't arrive on their driveway. That's about as far as I got.
And you were a tour guide.
Oh, and I was a tour guide at Universal Studios. Yes, yeah. Before it was automated. So there.
I love talking to people about their first jobs and seeing if
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome aboard. Whatever it is. Actually, I was a tour guide at Marine World Africa, USA, when it used to be on the peninsula. It was my first ceiling breaking effort. I was the first woman tour guide on the Tiger Raft Safari, where you have a 25-foot river raft and you have all these, tourists in it, and you drive an outboard motor and it's not on a track. And if you drive too close to where the ski show was, then it would push your boat up onto Monkey Island, where the monkeys would come and hang in the raft, and the tourists would then jump out of the raft.
So good preparation for politics.
It was good preparation for being governor of Michigan.
There you go. I want to fast forward a little bit. You graduate from Berkeley. You get to Harvard Law School, and there you meet your husband. And I understand that you courted during anti-apartheid protests on campus.
Yeah, he courted me, really. I thought when I first met him, and I would say if he were here, I thought that he was just a loser at first. But then, this is my husband. So we're totally different people. You know, Dan. And so I'm somebody, I like to make the lists. I like to get things done. I'm not alive if I'm not doing something. And Dan is not alive unless he's being. Seriously. I mean, he could stare at a baby for hours. When we went on our honeymoon in Ireland, I rented the car, and we were going to see the whole island in 1 week, and we weren't going to, miss any of the big stops. But he wanted to stop at every pub. He wanted to climb that mountain. He's the guy who smells the flowers. And in fact, when he was courting, he would press flowers in waxed paper and put poems in my mailbox at law school. The guy wore me down. How could you not fall in love with this guy, right? So I married Dan, and in doing so, I married Michigan.
And as a young couple, you originally thought that he would be the eventual governor of Michigan, or that might be a career path for him.
Yeah. So I was thinking that, I was politically active. I majored in political science and all of that, and I wanted to change the world, and I wanted to marry somebody who also wanted to change the world, and he did. And his dad was on the city council, and he came from a politically active family. And when we went for marriage prep, we're both Catholic, and we went to the Catholic church, and they ask you all sorts of things. The priest asked Dan, what if the party, I'm a Democrat, what if the Democratic Party comes to Jennifer and asks her to run for office instead of you? Because we were thinking, we'll go to Michigan, and Dan will run for office, and And he stopped for a moment because, being a supportive spouse probably wasn't the first thing on his list in terms of career paths. Being the first gentleman of Michigan was definitely not at the top of his list. He was the one who was either going to be governor or a priest or pope. So he didn't become pope, but he did become a saint for marrying me. When the priest asked that, Dan said, I would support her 100%. The priest somehow was prescient, because that's in fact what happened. And so I ran, and he became the supportive spouse. And I am eternally grateful for having married such a great man.
Your kids were tiny when you first ran for Attorney General. I think they were 7, 8, and 1.
Right, not even 1. Yeah.
How do you make the decision to enter public service, particularly given the pressures that you had at home?
Well, Dan and I actually were on a long car ride to Chicago to see our friends that Karen is a part of. We have an annual gathering of all of our law school buddies, and we had a long conversation in the car about what it would mean to run for office. And at that point, it was to run for Attorney General. And in Michigan, there was one guy who had been Attorney General for 37 years. He was the longest serving public servant in the country, and he had decided to step down, decided to retire. So it opened it up. And there were 7 guys running, and people came to me because at that point I was the corporation counsel for Wayne County, which is the largest county in Michigan. It's the county in which Detroit sits. And I had been a federal prosecutor, and so I had both the civil and criminal experience that attorney generals often have. And so they came to me and said, would you run? And so I went to Dan and thought, this is crazy. I've got kids. And Dan was like, a door opens, you go through it. I've got the kids, you go right now. It's important to the world. And after going through like divvying up responsibilities and all of that, after talking to our friends and sort of weighing these issues, I decided to jump in. Little did we know how, it's easy to talk about, and in reality, doing it is a whole another matter, because you are all of a sudden thrust into the public eye. And I know Dan didn't realize what he was in for, especially since, as we moved along, he had his own business. It was a big consulting firm. He was doing all this leadership training. And when I got into the public life, a lot of the clients that the state had, the contracts in the state, were customers that he also had. And so he had to cut his entire business off, essentially, to divest himself from anything. So he completely left that aside to when I became governor in particular, to be the first gentleman. And this is a guy, he went to Harvard Law School, he went to Yale. Really, he could have, he could be and do anything. And he sacrificed all of that to be the first gentleman.
So aside from cloning Dan,
I know.
How would you advise a woman who is thinking about public office and who has family responsibilities? What would you say to prepare for?
Well, I would say definitely marry well. And when I say marry well, I don't mean marry money. I mean marry somebody who will support you in your goals, who will allow you to spread your wings and fly, like my mom said. And often I think, the LGBT community has this down much better than the straight community, because they're going to make decisions upon who takes what job, what role, et cetera, based upon competencies. And often in the straight community, those decisions are left to, who's got the right plumbing, who's got the uterus to stay home and take care of kids. And so I think marrying a man or a woman who is not stuck in a box. And I say that women have, over the past decades have gotten out of their box. We can choose to be at home or out in the workplace. Men can't really choose that, or at least they haven't been allowed to make the choice to stay home necessarily. At least society hasn't given them the freedom. And I say marry a man who pulls off the shackles of expectations and feels free, if he is that type of person, to stay home. I mean, if you put my personality next to Dan's personality, go, that. Oh, look at this beautiful child, play the guitar for the baby. You would want him raising your kids. You wouldn't want me raising your kids. He's so much better at it than I am. So why not allow us as human beings to go with our natural tendencies and marry someone who is a person who will allow you to go with your strengths, and you be a person who's big enough to allow him to go with his or her.
Wonderful. You were elected governor in 2002, re-elected in 2006. The economics
Sucked.
Okay. We're indescribable, but you just did it. So, but you governed during incredibly difficult times. I know you teach a class on that right now at UC Berkeley Law School. But the state, maybe just paint the picture of what you dealt with, particularly in your second term.
Yeah, so, Michigan, I'm sure any of you read the papers, obviously we're the home to the domestic auto industry. And in 2008, when the meltdown happened, so because Michigan has a long history of manufacturing and of producing large consumer products when nobody's buying cars, the whole economy shuts down. When things are going great, Michigan is doing better than the country. When things are going poorly, Michigan does worse than the country. And in the first decade of this century, 2000 to 2010, the United States lost 50,000 factories because of globalization and the move for manufacturing jobs to lower wage countries and increases in productivity. Michigan was the epicenter of this globalization and loss of manufacturing jobs. It was autos, it was the suppliers to the auto industry, but it was other kinds of manufacturing as well. And so the question is, when you are leading a state that's in the middle of a massive transition from one type of state, from a DNA that was in one direction to a totally different thing, how do you communicate that to people? How do you let people feel proud of the history, but also know that they've got to do stuff to be successful in this new world, which has to be a knowledge-based economy, which has to have advanced manufacturing and life sciences and all sorts of diverse kinds of sectors that we had not had before. So it was difficult from both a very pragmatic loss of jobs, government is counter-cyclical, how do you provide the services when your tax base is dwindling, et cetera. There's that. And then there's the psychic part of it, which is how do you help people personally transition, thinking about the state and about themselves. The fact that people had, I tell this story a lot. I hope you don't mind me just sharing this. When I was in my first year of office, I got a call from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, which is our entity that helps businesses be successful in Michigan. And the vice president there said, Governor, it's a state agency. And Governor, we got a big problem. We got a big factory that is about to move to Mexico in a tiny town called Greenville. Greenville was a town of 8,000 people. And I said to him, well, how big is the factory? And he said, the factory has 3,000 employees of that town of 8,000. The town of Greenville grew up around refrigerator manufacturing. This is a refrigerator factory now owned by Electrolux, and they were going to move to Mexico. And this is the end of my first year, and I'm like, whoa, well, I'm not going to allow this major defeat to happen on my watch. Let me just bring the whole cabinet to Greenville, and we will put every incentive that we have on the table to convince Electrolux to stay in this little town, because it would be devastating. It would be like a nuclear bomb going off. So we did. We all went to Greenville. We were in this little room about the size of one of these squares up here, with all of the grand poobahs of Greenville, like the mayor and the city manager and the head of the community college and the head of the UAW who represented the workers. And we all basically said, what can you put on the table to convince Electrolux to stay? So we all, emptied our pockets of chips, made a pile, and slid our pile of incentives across the table to the management of Electrolux. And in that pile were things like 0 state and local taxes, 0 for 20 years. We would help to build them a whole new factory, because the factory was getting kind of old. The UAW put such a level of concessions on, they didn't want anyone to know. It was hundreds of millions of dollars of concessions over the period of time of 20 years. The community college was going to train new people. It was this whole deal. So Electrolux takes our list of incentives, and they go outside the room for 17 minutes. And they come back in, and they say, this is the most generous that any community has ever been to try to keep a factory. But there's nothing you can do to compensate for the fact that we can pay $1.57 an hour in Juarez, Mexico. So we're going. When these words, there's nothing you can do. It was this, what, there's nothing, I'll give you my children, whatever, just stay. Nothing. I remember going to the National Governors Association meeting, and the guy who's now the ambassador to China is Gary Locke, and he was the governor of Washington at the time, and he was head of the Democratic governors, and he was having this dog and pony show. Those of you who work in Sacramento, they bring in all the supporters of the Democratic Governors Association, and you get up and you give this, presentation about all the great things you've done, and Gary Locke is like, oh, and here's Jennifer Granholm, and at the time, believe it or not, I had a 70% approval rating. This was at the end of my first year. I hadn't, the word about Electrolux hadn't gotten out yet, but it was still like just completely hanging on me. So Janet Napolitano, who was then the governor of Arizona, next UC president, she'll be awesome. You got to get her. She's there. If you say that fast, right? She shares. Anyway, she gets up and she talks about what she's been doing in early childhood education, and then Kathleen Sebelius, who was head of Kansas, got up and talked about what she was doing. And then I got up and I tell them this story of Greenville. And they're like you guys. They're totally appalled, hanging over the room. And Gary Locke pulls me aside and he said, God, next time I tell you to get up and brag about something, maybe you could talk about a success and not a failure. Well, on the reason why I tell this is because on the last month that the last refrigerator came off the assembly line in Greenville, took a year or so for them to wind down. The employees had a gathering that they called the Last Supper. And it was at this huge pavilion in Little Greenville. And I wasn't invited, but I went because I was obsessed with this loss. And I went up to people were sitting around 8 top tables, no tablecloths, eating out of boxed lunches, and there was a band playing music, sad band and sad music. And it was like a community funeral, really. And this guy comes up to me, and he's got his 2 daughters, and he's got his baseball cap on, and he's got tattoos, and he says to me, Governor, he says, I want you to meet my 2 girls. They're teenagers. He said, I'm 48 years old, and I have worked at this factory for 30 years. I went from high school to factory. My father worked at this factory. My grandfather worked at this factory. All I know is how to make refrigerators. And then he puts his hand on his chest, and he says, so, Governor, tell me, who is ever going to hire me? And that question was asked by everybody in that room. And it's been asked by everybody at the 50,000 factories that closed in the first decade of this century. So that issue about how you prepare a state for a transition that is so deep and profound at the same time as they're seeing jobs go, that's the biggest challenge. And it's why I am obsessed today, still, with how you create jobs in America in a global economy.
I want to talk about the auto bailout, which I know was a terrifying moment in Michigan's history and in recent American history. Could you tell us how you worked with the president? Because I want to show something to our audience about the recovery from that bailout. But just talk a little bit. Federal loans, the loan program. But would you just talk about how close Michigan came to really collapsing when Barack Obama was elected?
So he was elected in November, obviously, and the week after he was elected, he had a transition meeting where he invited people like Larry Summers and Bob Reich and Laura Tyson and a number of economic people to come and advise him in his transition about what the economy looked like. And he invited me to come as well, and I was the first person to speak because the auto industry was in free fall at that moment. It was like an engine that was locked, and everything around, it was like a cancer patient. Everything was dying because the auto industry was dying, because the supply chain was crumbling. I don't know if any of you know what a WARN Act notice is, but it basically requires businesses to let the governor and the employees know if there's about to be a mass layoff. Mass layoff is 50 employees or more. When we had this meeting in November, I had received 58 WARN Act notices from the month before from businesses that were in this engine lock and that were about to lay people off. I laid out for the president and his team what we were experiencing. And then at this point, President Bush was still president. So we were begging the Bush administration at the same time, please, can you just give a loan so that we can carry through while this restructuring of the auto industry was happening? In January, when the president took office in the inauguration, I remember going up there, everybody's all fancy dancy and everything, and I remember going at this fancy dinner around to the table, to Larry Summers, to Hillary Clinton, to everybody saying, I just want you to know, Michigan is receiving 1 million calls a day on our unemployment hotline. Our system has broken down. Our phone system cannot even handle the volume. You have to your first priority has to be to present a lifeline to this industry. Now, I was totally opposed to bankruptcy. I thought that if, the auto industry went bankrupt, nobody would buy a car from a bankrupt company. And the president, I think, was really torn about this for quite a long period of time. But that period of time, that 6-7 month time between November and, say, June, when they actually did go through bankruptcy, was, you just cannot even imagine what it was like for people in Michigan not knowing whether the state was even going to survive because of our main employers going down and all the suppliers going down. By June, I think I had received like 1,200 WARN Act notices. It just kept on coming. And finally, thanks to the administration saving the auto industry and them emerging quickly from bankruptcy, at that point, our unemployment rate was 14.5%. And now it's about 8.8, so it's obviously stabilized significantly. A long way to go, but it was a brutal period.
Yeah. Well, you've all gathered by this point that Jennifer inherited her father's Swedish Reserve. I want to just show you a little bit about how that story unfolded. This is at the Democratic National Convention, talking about after the rescue, what happened. And this is your description of the recovery. So, it's coming? Okay.
President Obama, with the auto rescue, he saved more than 1 million American jobs. But it wasn't just Michigan. Hey. It wasn't just Michigan, my friends. In Colorado, the auto rescue saved more than 9,000 jobs. In Virginia, more than 19,000 jobs. In North Carolina, 25,000 jobs. In Wisconsin, 28,000 jobs. In Pennsylvania, 34,000 jobs. In Florida, 35,000 jobs. In Ohio, 150,000 jobs. And in the great state of Michigan, 211,000 good-paying American jobs. All across America, autos are back. Manufacturing is rebounding. Why?
They were crazy.
So I heard somebody say after that speech, I'll have what she's having. So I think we all feel that way.
I was pointing, just so that I was pointing to the delegations who had, people were saying, what is all this gesticulation? I was just trying to, let them know they were on. Anyway, whatever.
When politics is this much fun, and it's as hard as the meltdown that you had to govern during, why do you think so many women are reluctant to put themselves out there and get on the public stage and run for office?
Well, I do think that women need to be asked. I was asked. I wouldn't have done it myself. And often, it's not always true, but often, women need to be invited. I do think that women often, and again, I'm generalizing, but I think that we want to change the world, but we don't need to be the one in the front of the train. But the problem is, if we're not at the table, if we're not in the front, then policy happens that is not good for the country often. If our input is not there, it makes a difference in not a good way. I remember, when I was governor, the toughest pieces of legislation I would hand to a Republican senator and a Democratic member of the House, 2 women, who would do the hardest work of bringing the groups together to try to forge the compromises necessary. Without women in those positions, and we've gone backwards. When I was elected governor, there were 8 women who were governors, and now there are 5. When I was elected governor, there were I think 26% of the statewide elected officials were women, and now it's in the low 20s. I think that women see the polarization of politics and feel like, I don't want to stick my toe into the Puranic waters. It's so toxic that the polarization has pushed women out, in addition to pushing sort of folks who are in favor of compromise and pragmatism out. And that's exactly why women should run. That's exactly why we need to have more female voices in to bring the country back into balance. And I like to say to women, Karen, I would say this to all of you, you know, it's not about you. Running for office is not about you. It is about the changes that you want to see in the world. And in the same way that, you know, soldiers go off and serve our country, women can serve our country too, obviously overseas, but here at home. If you're willing to raise money for your favorite charity or the Humane Society or whatever, you can raise money for the cause of the change that you want to bring. So I am frustrated, like I think many are, that there are not more women in office. And I want women to have the skin that's thick enough to be able to sustain the arrows that will be thrown, and recognize that those arrows are not coming at you personally. You're wearing a suit, and they're coming at the suit, but it's not about you personally. And I think for the country's purposes, it's really important. She's got a stop sign.
Great advice. Okay, we could go on this subject, and we will when we get to our Q&A. But we have a tradition that she shares. We do a lightning round of questions, and you can just answer just rapid fire. Okay.
Whenever I used to go on shows or radio, when they wanted to do this, I said, "Are you kidding? I'm never going to do those." So
Here we go. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I wanted to be a veterinarian or a teacher, and I'm sort of teaching now, so I get to live that. And we just got a puppy, so.
If you could have one...
A jockey, too. I wanted to be a jockey.
If you could
but not now. I wouldn't want to be a jockey.
Okay.
Just to be clear.
If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
I would want to be able to force people to compromise, to reach consensus.
If you had to describe yourself in 3 words, which would you choose?
I would say I am passionate, I am energetic, and I want to lose 5 inches around my waist.
What advice would you give to your 18-year-old self?
Oh my God. Girl, do not go to LA and think that something great's gonna happen. Do not go on the dating game. For sure I would have said that. Although I do think it's important that I tried, because then, you know, if you never try, you never know. Failure is a good thing.
And few of us have our 70s hair so memorialized.
Right. Oh, my lords.
What are the advantages of getting older?
You know, I especially getting older and having done a few things, so you can relax. So, like, look, I now have a ponytail. I used to have really short hair when I was governor because I just didn't have time to deal with it. So now I just kind of get up and put my hair in a ponytail. It's so easy. I can go out, you know, and wear my sweats. Maybe it's because I'm here in California, nobody cares and nobody knows who I am, so I'm totally anonymous. I love all of that. But I love wrinkles. I love being able to not have to worry about how cute you are, you know? It's just, it's so liberating, I think. I love having the wisdom of years. I love people asking for advice.
Name one woman, past or present, who's inspired you.
For me, a great inspirational person was Ann Richards, former governor of Texas, obviously now deceased. Can I just quickly tell my Ann Richards story? I know this is rapid fire, but so Ann Richards, when I was governor, she had long stepped out, or long lost, actually. She was gone from being Texas governor, but she came and visited me in the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan. And I was so excited because she's totally my hero. She's so great and fabulous. And so she comes, and we're sitting around a conference table. And when I was elected, I had all men, in charge of the committees and, the House, majority leader, they're all women. I mean, all men. And when I was first elected, the other party controlled both branches of the legislature and the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State and the Supreme Court. I was like the lone Democrat. So she comes and meets me in my office, and she's got this great posture. And she said, I wish I could do her accent, but she said in some way, she said, how do you like working with all those men? And I said, oh my God. And I started to lament all of the things that were happening and how I had to veto more bills than any governor in history and all this. And she said, she sits up, she's got her white hair like this, she's got her pearls on. She said, honey, when those boys start giving you the blues, she smiled, she said, you just smile and give them the finger. I wish I had taken a picture of her in that posture.
All right, that is a She Shares first, and has stopped me in my tracks. And it's time for you all to ask questions. So why don't we, Allie's got the microphone, and if you have a question, just raise your hand and she'll come to you. And if you could identify yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Edie Lambert with KCRA, and I'll have the pleasure of getting a quick interview after this that will be on our news tonight at 6:30, by the way. But I wanted to share something about that Democratic convention speech because I was there, and we just had the luck of ending up with it live on our air. And this is how it unfolded, was I started my live shot saying, we're waiting for Eva Longoria. Do you remember she was after you? And I'm thinking, I don't know who this is.
Hurry up, get off.
I've got my notes, but I'm introducing a California-related package. And again, so Eva is going to be here any minute now. And my back, as I'm facing the camera, my back is to the entire arena and to the governor. And all of a sudden, I become aware of this energy, and people are just screaming, and it was just honestly magical. And so I'm becoming aware of this happening and unfolding on live television behind me, and I realized I need to get out of the way here and let our viewers participate in what's happening in this arena. So I do, and I said, I'm just going to let you listen in, and the photographer's panning, and I'm going through my notes like, who the hell is this? I'm like, the former governor, what?
Why do they have that brought up there?
So Jennifer Granholm, and and I'm a big, now I'm kind of listening, so I get that you're talking about the bailout, and you're involving that, making the connection. It's not just Michigan; it's the entire nation that was involved now and was part of this rescue, economic rescue, and just the way the crowd was energized was phenomenal.
Yeah, they were a big crowd.
It was, and I was there for everything. I hadn't seen anything like it. So we, I have to toss back, and now again we're waiting for Eva Longoria. So she does come up. By the end of our newscast, we're able to get her live, and the arena was literally like polite. It was so stunning, the difference between what was the anticipated kind of big act and you stole the show. So I wanted to share that with everybody because really actually being there, it's one thing to see it on tape, it was another thing to actually be in that arena, and it was so magical. If you could talk about the way that speech changed things for you politically, career-wise, because that speech did make you a household name.
Well, thanks. I'm not sure that it really has, but I appreciate that. I had there were a lot of people who, who emailed and all of that about it. It's sort of a cheap trick to identify delegations and call them out, right? It's like doing a graduation speech and, saying "Go Bears" and "Woo!" It's a surefire thing to be able to get people. But I'll tell you, it's funny, Edie, because I have spoken at a lot of conventions, and normally what they do, and you know this because you've covered them, so you're in the back, and the people they prep you back there, and they tell you only have, they help to write your speech for you, right? So they want to make sure the message is very clear and all of that. And they tell you only have a very short amount of time, because if you go over, then you're going to knock the president, because that was the night the president was speaking, you're going to knock them out of prime time. Bill Clinton was speaking that night. You can't do that. So I get there on the day of, and they say, "Oh, we've got to cut a third of your speech out." And I was flipping out because I had a great series of stories, but I also know that no one pays attention when they're on the floor of the convention. People get up like me, former politician, who gives a rip about someone like me? And people are out there, the delegates are, mingling and chatting, and so the people in the back say, "Don't worry that they're not paying attention to you. Remember, your audience is back home, so just look at the camera and don't worry about them not paying attention to you." And in fact, in my past convention speeches, that's pretty much what happened. They'd be out there mingling. A few people, my mom would be paying attention, but that's about it. And so you just talk to the people at home. And I assume that was what would happen on this one as well. So I get out there and I start to go, and all of a sudden I realize, hey, this crowd's actually paying attention. That's kind of cool for a convention. And so it ended up being very fun, because it was a good call and response in terms of being able to have fun with it. And at that point where I had to stop because they were being so loud, and I had to go fast because I had to get it all in, and they were going to come with a hook and get me off so the president could be on and so I had to stop for just a minute to allow the crowd so I could finish my remarks. But it ended up working out really well from at least the folks who were in the convention hall's point of view. If you weren't in the convention hall, and a lot of this went up on YouTube, and a lot of the folks who would be adversarial, the Republicans, adversarial to the folks, what was going on, there was a lot of criticism about it, because they were all saying, "What is she high on? What is she drunk? Is she, whatever?" And my whole response was, "I'm high on democracy, hon."
That's great. And Allie over here.
You're not filming that, are you? Just asking.
Too late.
Edie's right. You were the inspiration for women that night. And when I saw you 2 years ago, I came running up to you and said, "Please run for president." And you said to me, "I can't. I'm a Canadian." So I remember it well. So who in the list, if Hillary chooses not to run, those of us...
She's going to run.
Well, who else?
I'm willing it to happen.
I'm willing it too, but others argue differently. So who else is out there that...
Well, I do think that there are a lot of great women. You've got people who have served in the cabinet who are great. Kathleen Sebelius and Janet, they're great women. A lot of great women in Congress. You've got, all these women senators. We now have a record number of women senators. So I think there is a decent pipeline. But the great thing about Hillary, in my opinion, and again, I know this is a bipartisan group, but the Hillary phenomenon, from my perspective, in my generation, now we have somebody who is, in fact, as Ann Richards used to say, you have to be twice as qualified to be considered, and women dancing backwards in high heels, all that whole line. Well, she is twice as qualified as anybody. She has done all of that. And those who would be criticizing her now because she's too old, after somebody who has actually done all of this that everybody's asked of her, to be criticized for that, to me, is outrageous. So I think we do have a number of great women in the pipeline, but I think she, until she opts something else, I think that she is the formidable front runner.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Weiss with the American Red Cross, and I'm actually a fellow Michigander.
I
grew up in the UP.
Oh, you're a Youper!
I am a Youper, yes. And I went to Michigan State, and
awesome.
I have lots of friends that are still in Michigan.
You see I'm wearing green?
Yeah, I do. Very good. So my question is, Michigan has been through this twice now. We went through it in the 80s, and now we went through it again. Do you think they actually might have finally learned the lesson and are starting to diversify, or Are we going to go through this again?
No. I mean, when you have such a history, obviously, of manufacturing, you've got so much of your economy revolving around it, your transition to a new economy doesn't happen overnight, as you know. So, we brought in experts to identify which sectors that we could diversify into, taking advantage of our strengths, our incumbent industry, but also our resources, our geography. We identified 6 sectors. We fashioned policy around each of those sectors to be able to, encourage different kinds of businesses to come in. My successor is doing something similar, identifying similar sectors, because the experts are all pretty clear about it. I think that it just takes time for that kind of transition to happen. It's quicker to see the losses of jobs because of globalization than it is to attract new industry when industry in whatever sector can choose to go anywhere in the world, whereas that wasn't so much the case in the last century. So it's an issue for Michigan. It's an issue for every state in the country. I do think, though, that we as a nation cannot give up on advanced manufacturing. We cannot give up on making things. If we give up on that, we will exacerbate this hollowing out of the middle class that we have seen in every study that has come out recently. So advanced manufacturing, I think, which requires advanced degrees, innovation, production, is still an opportunity for the United States, and I think we've got to have manufacturing policy that surrounds it on a federal level.
Okay. And we have one more. We have time for one more question in the back. Allie, do you? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm Heather David from McClatchy High School, and I was wondering, what's the favorite job you've ever had and why?
Well, what a great question. All right, so apart from being governor, I'll just say that, because that really was a challenging job, but a great job. I would say the most fun job was being a federal prosecutor. Being able to go into courtroom and, since I was prosecutor, those defense attorneys, they're in my space, but I owned the courtroom. Right, Judge? I wanted to be able to, right. Well, it's your courtroom too, right. I shared it with the judge, all right. But the jury was mine. So I loved that stage. So I wasn't able to be an actress, but it allowed me to actually be in a persuasive role with a jury and feel like you're making the community safer. I really enjoyed that a great deal.
Good. We have time for one last question.
Can I finish up with one thing?
What's that?
Can I finish up with one
Sure.
thing?
Okay. Hi, Terry Thomas, and I own a lobbying firm here in Sacramento, lobby the California legislature, and I actually represent the movie industry, and I know you were very, very supportive of the movie industry when you were governor, so thank you very much.
Yes, trying to poach it from California.
Yeah, but that we don't like. Yeah. But I just wanted to ask you, after all of these really intense, fast-paced jobs that you've had, how you find academia?
Yeah, it's a totally different pace, that's for sure. You know what, I actually, I'm not finished. I'm not sure what's next, but I'm not finished. But this is a really nice space for me to be in at the moment. I'm here because my dad has had a couple of strokes, and so we wanted to take, every governor will tell you when they leave office, you got to get out for a couple of years because whoever comes after you will undo everything you've done. It'll drive you crazy. So from a mental health perspective, it's good to get away. My husband is also teaching at Berkeley, so it's a really nice moment. My son is, my youngest is a junior in high school. I get to be, more flexible for him. Right now, I'm serving on a couple of boards, et cetera. So the pace is different. It's totally different. And I will want to get back into the swing of a full pace again at some point. But for right now, for this moment in time, it's actually lovely.
Okay. So we finished our Q&A, but I know you had
I just wanted to say
thought.
one other thing, which is this, and this sort of is related to the question you asked about women running for office and anybody running for office. And I have to quote Nancy Pelosi on this. I had before I get to her, I had a driver, governor goes around in the bubble, right? So you get a driver and all of that. And one of the drivers that I had, a guy who was my body guy actually, He used to bring me in the backs of places like this and introduce me to the people who were serving and the janitors. And he would always say, Gov, you cannot make policy unless you really see people, unless you see them all. And I hope that for those of you who have another chapter in you or have a future in you, that you put yourself in a position to feel people's pain, to see where other people are coming from, because you can only be effective if you've walked that with them. I hope, the young people get a chance to work in a homeless shelter or get a chance to really understand where people are coming from when they're struggling. Nancy Pelosi talks about visiting this South African bishop, and on the bishop's door was a prayer, and it went like this. It's a saying. It said, "When at last I stand before the face of God, God will say to me, 'Show me your wounds.' And if I have no wounds, if I have no scars, God will then ask, 'Was there nothing worth fighting for?'" So in the end, I hope we all bear the scars and wounds of battles that were worth waging on behalf of people. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you. You are officially a She Shares member. Jennifer Granholm, thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to just take a moment and thank the incredibly hardworking staff at the Dewey Square Group who put on these events. I want to thank Taylor Greenberg, Julia Wright, Tamara Torlickson, Ali Maloney, Sarah Reinheimer, Naveen Habib. Thank you all for coming. And I want to let you know that our next She Shares, our year-ender, will be December 12th. That's a Thursday with Martina Kolakatronis, who's president of business operations for the Sacramento Kings. So we hope we'll see you then, and thank you for coming.
All right. Thank you.